In 1967 I was about to start my 4th year and last year at Sydney Uni when I came to Tassie to spend time with my sister and brother-in-law on the boat, the Just David. It was the lighthouse supply vessel and also a charter fishing boat. On the day when the fires really got going and reached their peak, we had been down at Eagle Hawk Neck and had received the message we ought to get back to Constitution Dock because perhaps the boat could be at risk. So we drove back through the smoke and the flames with a 2-year-old boy in the car with us and a 40-gallon drum of petrol in the back. The police had suggested we ought to stop, but we kept on going. When we got back, the Port Authority contacted my brother-in-law and said, "Can you take some sailors out to Tasman Island? We've just received advice that the island is on fire and they need help." Of course, said my brother-in-law, and later that evening a group of sailors with the navigating officer appeared onto the boat, and shortly after midnight we took off for Tasman Island. The sailors have been regaling to us their stories of a wild and harried trip across Bass Strait on HMAS Derwent, I think it was, at 32 knots, and how rough it had been. We listened to that. Anyway, shortly after midnight we set off for Tasman Island. It was all going well until we hit Storm Day, of course. It had been blowing so heavily and for so long that there were very, very big seas. We weren't doing 32 knots, we were doing a steady 7.5 to 8 knots towards Tasman Island. And the boat rose up onto these big waves, screwed over the top, fell down to the bottom, took water over the bows, corkscrewed back up to the top, and so it went on for hour after hour. It wasn't long before all of the sailors, apart from a brave few down in the cabin, were up on the deck being violently ill. The majority joined the ones down below joined them shortly after when my sister decided to make bacon and eggs and asked who would like to be involved. Several hours later we arrived at Tasman Island, and these sailors had had a terrible time. There was no more than 3 or 4 of the group who had survived seasickness. When we pulled in behind Tasman Island, the lighthouse keeper and my brother-in-law spoke to each other on the radio. He said, "Look, the fires are all out, but send the boys up anyway. I've got a few jobs for them." Now in those days, Tasman Island was made accessible by a flying fox which had a carriage which hung above the water off a rock, went to a landing stage, and then had a rack railway which took people to the top. But the rack railway had been burnt out. So we arrived at Tasman Island and were looking at how these poor sailors were going to get up onto Tasman Island. I was looking at the carriage which hung on the flying fox over the water and thinking to myself, this is going to be interesting. Then I was tapped on the shoulder by my brother-in-law and said, "Right, get the dinghy down and get the sailors over there." 2 by 2 I loaded them into the dinghy, and with such a big swell running, I had to try and paddle the dinghy under the flying fox carriage so we could time the jump from the dinghy into the carriage so that they got in safely. Well, inevitably, of course, it didn't always work. The sea bottom there is littered with about 4 or 5 very large fire extinguishers. One of the things we carried was a bale of hay. There was a horse on Tasman Island. Would you believe that? A horse. Anyway, so these poor guys, one of them of course didn't quite make time to jump properly and ended up half in the water and half out. So we finally got them onto the landing stage. I remember watching through the binoculars this bedraggled, miserable group of sailors winding their way up around the side of Tasman Island to the top on a very, very narrow trail. Well, we wandered off, of course, and anchored, and sometime later in the afternoon, we got the message from the lighthouse keeper saying, come on down, look, they're finished now. Same thing again. I rode out these poor sailors. They were trying to get off the Flying Fox into the dinghy, which, if anything, was even more difficult. So eventually we loaded them all onto the boat, heading back towards Hobart. Same thing over again, 8 knots, but we're climbing up over the waves, corkscrewing over the top, crashing down to the bottom. The lieutenant who was with us had a sidearm, and as we were getting closer to the entrance into Port Arthur, he said to my brother-in-law, this is too rough, it's too dangerous. We must go for shelter, pull into Port Arthur. And my brother-in-law said, no way, mate, got to get back. I wouldn't be here if I thought it was dangerous with my 2-year-old son on board. The lieutenant then patted with a revolver in his holster and said, I could make you, My brother-in-law said to him, staring ahead as he steered the boat, you touch this, mate, and you're in the water. Well, eventually we got back into Hobart, and they were the most miserable group of Royal Australian Naval sailors you've seen in your life. We didn't even get the chance to tie the boat up properly, and they were gone. But there you go. They did a great community service on Tasman Island. Most of them will never, I think, boast about their 32 knots dash across Bass Strait compared to their 8-knot cruise in a fishing boat into Tasman Island. And they did a great job on repairing the wreck railway for the lighthouse keeper.